There is no Andy Johnson policy, no Throckmorton Confederate record, no Jack Hamilton rebel coalition in the present program. Let the people of Texas rejoice. Come thou with us, and we will do thee good. Houston Tri-Weekly Union, a radical paper. We had hoped, and we believe the Republican Party of the nation hoped, that with the completion of Reconstruction, the rights, interests, and wishes of the people would everywhere be respected. There were so many wicked and foolish things connected with the reconstruction of the southern states that the Republican Party is already seriously injured thereby. Austin Daily Republican, a conservative organ. The events of 1867 in Texas convinced the vast majority of Texans that whatever face had been put on it, the real drive of the North in the war between the states was for domination of the South. The evidence is overwhelming that most Texans had accepted the indivisibility of the Union and the fact of legal emancipation of the slaves, which were the primary and secondary issues of the war. Texans, with other Southerners, did not accept the idea of Negro equality, but that had never been a Union commitment. The fact that, in the same year that a majority of Northern states prohibited Negro voting by law, it was thrust by federal fiat on the South, was not lost on them. It was felt by virtually the whole population that the policy of the United States was to continue the prostration of the conquered states through easily manipulated Negro suffrage. With the stubborn and honorable J.W. Throckmorton out of the way, General Charles Griffin proceeded to cleanse the state. Armed by continuing Reconstruction acts from Congress, the U.S. Army carried out a purge of all state officials, which reached deep down to the county level. Everywhere, office holders, even petty ones, with a Confederate past, were dismissed. They were replaced with Union men. There were not nearly enough capable Unionists to go around, and many exceedingly dubious appointments were made. In this period, there seemed to be an intensification of hatred toward former Confederates on the part of Northern officers. The entire military hierarchy, Grant, Sheridan, and Griffin, took views that can only be called tyrannical. The test, or ironclad oath, was extended to civil juries. Prospective jurors who could not swear that they had never voluntarily served or supported the Confederacy were barred. This act removed 9/10 of the white population from jury duty, and its real effect was to destroy the civil courts. Congress, on March 23, 1867, extended the disenfranchisement of Southerners to include all persons who had ever held a state or federal office before the rebellion and later supported the Confederacy. The U.S. Attorney General ruled liberally on this, presuming it applied only to major offices. Generals Griffin and Sheridan interpreted the edict much more strictly, with Grant's express approval. In Texas, any man who had ever been a mayor, school trustee, clerk, public weigher, or even a cemetery sexton was disenfranchised. The Grant-Sheridan view was later written into congressional law. Another military edict, which Congress validated in July, was to give registration boards complete authority to accept or reject applicants on the grounds of loyalty, as each board saw fit. The boards were in the hands of Army officers or Union men. In a state which was only about 1/4 Negro, they registered 49,779 Negroes to 59,633 whites. A strong effort was made to place every freedman on the rolls. The most surprising aspect of this operation was that most federal officials pretended to view it as essentially moral. The enormous social gulf between the auction block and the voting booth was ignored, or demolished with the argument that in no other way could past sins be rectified. Whatever truth or morality this argument had was utterly lost on Texans, because the process was so self-serving to the Republican hierarchy. The Army and the Freedmen's Bureau not only registered the Negro vote, both agencies also told the registrants incessantly who had freed the slaves and who now had presented them with the ballot. Understandably, despite an ineffective flowering of the Ku Klux Klan in Texas, they garnered the Negro vote. During this period, the president opposed the congressional Reconstruction every step of the way. His vetoes were overridden. He was growing more lame duck each day. The Southerner in the White House was without influence. The Congress deprived him of his constitutional command of the Army by completely detailing, through law, the Army's operations in the South. The Senate prevented him from appointing any pro-Johnson men to his administration. Finally, when Johnson tried to fight back, it moved to impeach him. No president was ever quite so thoroughly mauled. The impeachment failed to carry by one vote, and only because certain cooler Republican heads in business and finance outside the Congress prevailed. The form of presidential government thus survived, and the concept of a tribunate of the people, which Jackson began and Lincoln fostered, could await a stronger man. The consensus of most historians, North and South, is that this congressional uprising was a national disaster. Delegates to a state constitutional convention to rewrite the Texas Instrument in accord with Northern prejudices were elected in early 1868. This convention met at Austin in June. So complete was the political revolution that only 6 men who had sat in the convention of 1866 came to Austin in 1868. The Republican slates of delegates won 44,689 to 11,440. A democratically inspired campaign to invalidate the elections by sitting them out, a majority of registered voters had to cast ballots, barely failed. The Democratic slogan was, "Better Yankee than nigger rule," but just enough whites voted to legalize the result. The new Constitution emerged in conformance with prevailing Republican thought. It strongly reflected centralization and the aspirations of the national, if not the Texas, middle classes. The governor was given a 4-year term and the power of appointing all top state officials, including the justices of the state courts. County courts were abolished. Political offices were thus made stronger and power largely removed from local influences, especially the influence of the planter class. Another important innovation was a centralized state public school system, funded by public land sales, a poll tax, and from the general revenue. Until this time, Texas had not had statewide public schools. Unrestricted Negro suffrage was guaranteed by a clause prohibiting disenfranchisement by race, color, or former condition of servitude. But only those whites already barred from voting by the 14th Amendment were disenfranchised. Overall, the new Constitution was a conservative Republican rather than a radical document. Because of this, there was a violent split in the Republican ranks. Although the conservatives, under A.J. Hamilton and E.M. Peace, prevailed, only 45 members of the convention signed the finished instrument in February 1869. The Radicals, under E.J. Davis and Morgan Hamilton, A.J. Hamilton's brother, bolted the convention toward the end. Their policies were strikingly different. Radicals wanted to disenfranchise all Confederates and to divide Texas into 3 new states, permitted under the original terms of annexation. Both factions carried their positions to Washington, the seat of all real power. General J.J. Reynolds, the new military chief who replaced Griffin when that officer succumbed to yellow fever on the coast, sided strongly with Jack Hamilton. He expressed strong conservative Republican views, arguing that only white men should serve as registrars and opposed division of the state. He chided the Radicals for acting like children and bolting, and Radical chieftains were able to prevent their rump convention from asking for his removal by only a single vote. History, however, is a series of accidents. Reynolds had a secret wish to cap his career by entering the United States Senate. Preferring the mild Texas climate and seeing a chance of preferment in his grasp, he had his secret desire carried to conservative leader A.J. Hamilton. Hamilton officially let it be known that the Republicans could find a stronger man. What he said privately about this proposition threw the general into a white-faced fury. Jack Hamilton was understandably reluctant to promise one of the most hated men in Texas a Senate seat, but his refusal set the stage for tragedy. Elections now were scheduled to select the new state government that would bring Texas back into the Union for a 3rd time. E.M. Peace had been appointed provisional civil governor by General Sheridan in New Orleans, but Peace was to hold office only until the end of Reconstruction. Elisha Peace was a moderate, a former Texas governor who was more Whig than either Democrat or Republican, and so far as he could, served the state well. He had very little real power, as events soon showed. At the start of 1869, it appeared that the conservative Republicans would win the elections and organize the state. The majority of these men were longtime residents. They were Southerners with basic Unionist rather than secessionist views. In fact, both the conservatives and the Democrats considered fusion with each other, but the idea failed. The scars on the blue and the gray were still too new for full cooperation, though little real hatred separated the two. The conservatives had the support of most prominent men and the backing of every important newspaper in Texas. The radical faction, meanwhile, was a minority within a minority and were detested not only by A.J. Hamilton's group, but by almost every white person in the state. When they organized early in 1869 and presented their own candidates for office, E.J. Davis for governor, J.W. Flanagan lieutenant governor, Jacob Kuchler land commissioner, and George Honey treasurer, it seemed they had no chance. They did not even put up their own ticket by choice, but because the conservatives would no longer tolerate them within the regular Republican Party. The radical leaders were Texas residents, though they were supported by people arrived out of the North, such as Freedmen's Bureau officials, Army officers, and the like. However, the whole faction began to get a new name: carpetbaggers, a cynical allusion to the fact that many Yankees came south with their entire worldly possessions in a traveling case. The term, unfair in Texas as compared with other southern states, clung. The radicals, both native scalawags and carpetbaggers, were a remarkable band of political buccaneers. Their ideology, beyond unionism, was primarily a dislike for the old Southern order and a general desire to remake Texas more in the order of a northern state. In this, they were moderns, but their main cement was a hunger for political office. They had no real uniformity. E.J. Davis, discharged as a Union brigadier, was impeccably honest in money matters. Most of his closest cronies were not. The genuine idealists among the radicals were few. Morgan Hamilton, A.J.'s brother, was a Southern gentleman among thieves. These potential pirates always realized their best friends were in the Northern Congress. That men such as Charles Sumner tolerated them and even supported them can be laid only to the fact that the radical program lay nearer than the conservative one to the hearts of Northern politicos. Jack Hamilton was as appalled as Throckmorton at the social revolution Reconstruction intended, and equally determined to restore the society of the state. This Northern bias in their favor was a tremendous asset. Political history turned upon it, and upon the fact that J.J. Reynolds, an Army general, had the ear and confidence of U.S. Grant, who had just been elected overwhelmingly as President of the United States. Reynolds switched sides. In a state still under military occupation, this was decisive. During the summer of 1869, the Army systematically stripped all Hamilton men of political offices, patronage, and favors. The vacant offices were filled with Davis men. With the connivance of the Army, Davis made an alliance with G.T. Ruby, state president of the Union League, a secret society whose members had come south to educate the Negroes to vote radical Republican. Between the Union League and the Army, the freedmen were dragooned and told that A.J. Hamilton intended to re-enslave them. In this way, the Davis radicals began to gain control of the powerful black vote. Jack Hamilton, who considered himself a loyal Republican, protested vigorously to Washington. General Reynolds, however, had the final word. He wrote President Grant on September 4, 1869, that the election of A.J. Hamilton meant a restoration of Confederate government in Texas, and that the only real Republican party in the state was led by Davis. Grant, who seems to have been a basically honest man presiding over a world he did not understand, listened to the general and to his party radicals in the North. he turned the full power of the federal government behind Davis. Peace, the puppet provisional governor, was so nauseated he immediately resigned. He wrote Grant bitterly in his letter of resignation that 8/10 of all educated, a euphemism for white, Republicans, favored Hamilton, and that Davis represented a carpetbagger and Negro supremacy party. Davis retorted that the conservatives had sold out to the rebels. Grant's advisers lined up even more strongly behind him. The real tragedy of the Texas election of 1869 was not the imposition of carpetbagger rule, but the fact that to impose it, the entire democratic political process was perverted. Less damage would have been done had the Army simply continued martial rule. There had been no organized opposition when the Reconstruction Acts were forced upon the South. Despite great bitterness, Southern leaders everywhere counseled meekness. Former Confederate generals from Beauregard to Throckmorton indicated that Southerners were a conquered people, the actual words most commonly used, and must submit. There was a belief that the American political process would eventually be restored. The problem was that radical rule in Texas could only be imposed by bayonets or wholesale chicanery and fraud. United States authorities, unable to countenance the first, chose the second. Such was the feeling of the day. Reynolds appointed only Davis men as voting registrars on October 1, 1869. These officials were given almost limitless powers. Their abuses, if this were to be any kind of representative election, were also without limit. Although it was prohibited in the Constitution, men who had volunteered for Confederate service were rejected. Further, Texans who were known Unionists and had suffered for it were also rejected and forbidden to register, if it was known that they were Hamilton men. This included thousands of men who had registered freely the previous year. Then, after registration ended, some thousands of names were arbitrarily stricken from the rolls. In some cases, there seems to have been no political reason, merely personal prejudice. The election, held between November 30th and December 3rd, 1869, was supervised by Davis radicals, backed fully by the Army. Military detachments stood at every polling place. At each, an Army officer acted as election official. The polling was a farce, conducted in an air of white resignation and gloom. Negroes, some in slave rags, were herded to the polls. Led by radical white men, they came singing, "As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free." They were voted. No Negro was refused the right on any grounds. Democrats had put up Hamilton Stewart, editor of the Galveston Civilian. They knew he could not win. Also, most Democrats feared that if he did, the North would impose full martial law. Few Democrats even attempted to vote. Most whites tried to vote for Jack Hamilton, the conservative Republican. The Army had been ordered to close the polls in any place where trouble occurred. Significantly, this occurred only in heavily white counties, where Army officers apparently were hoping for reasons to stop the voting on any pretext. If a voter found his name stricken and argued the fact, the polls were immediately closed down. This cut the Hamilton vote. In Navarro County, the registrar realized a heavy Hamilton majority was certain to be cast. This man took the registration lists and departed before the election. No votes from Navarro were ever counted. In Milam County, the polls opened, but the results were never reported in. They were not even counted. In Hill County, the ballots were removed to another jurisdiction and counted by a single official, a Davis man. He reported a huge Davis majority, despite the fact that the vote certainly went the other way. Less than one-half the registered white voters in Texas, in these circumstances, were able to cast a ballot. There was no canvass, nor were the ballots ever made public. General Reynolds certified to President Grant that Davis had been elected by a vote of 39,901 to 39,092. Despite the fact that affidavits charging fraud were sworn before magistrates all over the state, and even a number of U.S. Army officers protested to Reynolds about this farce, Reynolds certified the entire radical ticket, and Grant refused to investigate. Hamilton was counted out. Despite all handicaps, the evidence is overwhelming that he got almost the entire white vote. The returns on the ratification of the new state constitution were perhaps an indication. This was a conservative document which the radicals detested. It carried 72,466 to 4,928. Led by E.M. Peace, a dozen Republicans of known integrity petitioned Washington. Documented cases of serious fraud presented to Congress and the President were ignored. In an atmosphere reeking of Spanish cigars and sour bourbon whiskey, the radicals congregated in the Capitol at Washington. General Reynolds eased the new regime on its way. On January 8, 1870, by general order, he appointed the officials-elect to office before their constitutional terms began. He convened the new 12th legislature on February 8th. Before convening it, he took the unusual step of appointing Major B. Rush Plumlee Speaker of the Texas House. The 12th legislature contained a radical majority. 17 radicals, 7 conservative Republicans, and 6 Democrats sat in the Senate. 2 of them were Negro. There were 50 radicals, 19 conservatives, and 21 Democrats in the House. 11 state representatives were black. 4 Texas congressmen had been elected. 3 were radicals. The 4th, who claimed to be a Democrat, was a discharged Union Army officer and carpetbagger. The legislature routinely ratified the 14th and 15th Amendments to the federal Constitution without serious debate. J.W. Flanagan and Morgan Hamilton were elected to the U.S. Senate. On March 30, 1870, the President signed an act of Congress admitting the Texas delegation to sit in Washington. General Reynolds relinquished military authority to the Davis regime on April 16th. The Davis crew, flamboyant and energetic, was not without ability and a certain political genius. They had smelled the wind's direction and correctly trimmed their sails. Now they showed a remarkable amount of political inventiveness. Davis, who was born in Florida in 1827 and arrived in obscure circumstances in Texas in 1848 with his widowed mother, typified the rise of a new type of American officeholder. At some time he apparently read law, but no details are known. His main thrust in life was seeking office. In 1850 he gained the position of Deputy Customs Collector of the Rio Grande. In 1853, he became a district attorney, and the year afterward, district court judge at Brownsville. He married the daughter of an Army officer, and while in this post, opted for the Union in 1861. He spent the war either in exile in Mexico or fighting Rip Ford's cavalry along the Rio Grande. He was commissioned a colonel of cavalry and discharged at San Antonio in 1865 as a U.S. brigadier. He had no reason to love Texans, nor they him. By 1866, he was a leader of the faction demanding disenfranchisement of ex-Confederates, division of the state, and Negro suffrage. Now, in 1870, E.J. Davis was governor of Texas. He was personally honest, and there were far worse Reconstruction governors in the southern states. But Davis had some notions that bespoke a native ingenuity, and afterward, as a reaction, were to have long-lasting effects on his adopted state. The first considered action of the Davis administration was to extend its term of office. Under the 1869 Constitution, elections for Congress were to be held again in 1870 and for state officers in 1871. Davis's legislature, by majority vote, postponed both till November 1872. The official excuse was to make local and federal elections coincide. Davis privately mentioned that the people would not be sufficiently reconstructed before 1872. Morgan Hamilton, when he heard of this in Washington, choked on it. Probably Hamilton had been sent to the Capitol to get him out of the way. Davis next proposed a number of bills, each of which was most unusual in the American 19th century. The first was called the Militia Bill. The title was innocent. All states had militia regulations. But the Texas law put all male citizens between 18 and 45 subject to military duty under the personal command of the governor. Its startling provisions beyond this were: the governor was permitted to declare martial law in any Texas county, suspend the laws, and maintain this until the legislature convened. The governor could assess the districts put under martial law for all costs of such operation, and also assess punishment of offenders. Another radical bill was a provision for a state police. This would consist of 200 men under the command of the governor through the state adjutant general. The state police would have the authority to operate anywhere. Hitherto, law enforcement was limited to sheriffs and local constables who could not cross county lines. The state police was to have extraordinary powers, including an unconstitutional privilege of taking offenders from one county to another for trial, and of operating undercover as secret agents. At this time, there was no such force in any American state. The Enabling Act enabled the governor to control patronage on a truly kingly scale. Under it, he could appoint mayors, district attorneys, public weighers, and even city aldermen. It centralized power and patronage in the executive's hands as no American legislation ever had. Davis could and did appoint 8,538 state officials, earning $1,842,685 in salaries, and another 1,386 officers who were paid by fees. The printing bill provided an official public printer, a state journal, and provided that regional newspapers be designated to print the various required official notices. This, in effect, instantly created an official state press, subject to government control and influence. The terms police state and propaganda machine had not yet come into American English. The Davis administration, in power in a state where 9/10 of the white population detested it, was instinctively and logically doing what came naturally. It had not arrived in power through the democratic process. It could not be expected to behave democratically. These radical bills passed the Texas House easily, where the radical majority was absolute. But a deadlock over the militia and police bills developed in the Senate. The 13 conservative Republican and Democratic state senators formed a solid opposition bloc. A tie vote emerged. The governor handled this first legislative crisis firmly. All 13 opposition party senators were arrested and detained. This broke the tie, but someone noticed the state Senate now lacked a quorum. 4 of the detained men were released and hustled to the Capitol to solve the problem. One of these officers was expelled shortly afterward for resisting arrest. The remaining conservative and Democratic officeholders were kept under house arrest for 3 weeks. During this time, the entire package of radical legislation was rushed through. A.J. Hamilton, E.M. Peace, and James W. Throckmorton joined in a joint appeal to the Congress to restore Texans the civil rights guaranteed under the federal Constitution. Discredit was thrown upon their loyalty to the nation, and the appeal was not acted upon. The years of carpetbagger rule were gaudy, violent, sometimes comic in retrospect, but always tragic at the time. The national view towards the era wavers with whatever view toward the American Negro minority happens to be fashionable at any given time. The regime was founded on Union bayonets and Negro votes, but evidence is small that it did either the Union or the unfortunate minority any good. Negroes put the carpetbaggers in the state house, but with rare exceptions, the ragged horde did not share the wealth. A large number of men who were indisputably honorable actively supported this sort of rule in Texas and other states. Probably, wrapped in their own drives and biases, honorable men in the U.S. government simply failed to see the folly of permitting the domestic wreckage in Texas. Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, in most respects, was as blind to the cruelty, injustice, and folly committed in the name of Reconstruction of the South as contemporary English governments were blind to the cruelties and follies of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy. The period was a weird melange of corruption and genuine social reform. Negro suffrage, combined with white disenfranchisement and wholesale fraud, produced a political revolution. Meanwhile, social and economic revolutions went on. A few years after the war, the bottom rail was on the top, as Texans said. Corruption was most evident in the printing and railroad bills. Davis appointed some 10,000 men to valuable offices and made the fortunes of many, but this was essentially legitimate patronage. So were the enormous increases in salary the legislators voted office holders, and their own increase in per diem. The new governing class were poor men without a touch of aristocratic ideal or ethic. They possessed an enormous middle-class grasp for money, and they voted themselves a raise. This was characteristic and inevitable. It would happen again. The real corruption, however, came with the $200,000 the printing bill gave the administration to spend. Radical news sheets sprouted in the state like noxious weeds. Railroad legislation provided similar windfalls. The legislature voted the International Railroad Company 20 sections of land for each mile of track and tax exemption for 25 years. Similar grants were provided the Southern Transcontinental and Southern Pacific. In credit to Edmund Davis, these acts were passed over his veto, and his veto stopped several other similar bills. At the same time the state gave away its lands, enabling acts of the legislature allowed cities to vote large railroad and other bonds, totaling more than $1 million. These acts were in contradiction to the Constitution of 1869. In their defense, proponents of railroad legislation could point to more than 1,000 miles of new track. Opponents saw resources of the state, more than required to subsidize the tracks, handed to corporate interests, which profited enormously. They saw a huge increase in taxes and bonded debt, which went to pay for the liberality the radicals bestowed. Most of all, they saw legislators who had never had a dime sprouting gold watches and gold-headed canes, building or buying fine mansion houses, and driving English carriages behind blooded horses. The railroad boys and other lobbyists did spread a bit of their windfalls around. Much radical legislation could stand the inspection of time. The carpetbaggers tried to build a state road system, though they never progressed beyond levying taxes to support it. They passed a homestead exemption law by which no homestead of 200 acres or less could be seized for debt, except a direct mortgage. The State School Acts of 1870 and 1871 created a genuine free public school system for the first time, adequately supported by taxation. In requiring compulsory attendance for children between 6 and 18 without regard to race, the legislature was 50 years ahead of the age. In its centralization, with a state superintendent, state board of education, and 35 district supervisors, who appointed local school boards and thus removed control of education completely from the public, the radicals were more than a century in advance of America. Even the good things were intensely unpopular because the regime itself was universally held in contempt. The corruption and extravagances of the carpetbaggers, which reflected the worst of Anglo-American politics, have been easily seen. The rise of a new mercantile and landowning class with them in Texas has not been so clearly marked. The almost complete destruction of the old planter gentry, not by the war, but in its aftermath, escaped attention. But it is a truism, if not universally true, that few families that had wealth or station prior to 1860 survived the following 2 decades with either. The war bankrupted the planter class by destroying its capital in money and slaves. The principal assets of the planters had always been invested in Negroes. They vanished on Juneteenth. The planters still held land, but they were unable to hold it long. Without labor, they could not put it back in production. And for several critical years, the labor situation in Texas and the whole South remained in turmoil. The stabilization of 1866 could have saved many planters, but it was overturned. The freedmen once again came to believe they would be cared for by the government. The radicals made promises, though they were not kept. Millions of acres were freely granted for the development of rail lines. Hardly a dollar, and not an acre, went to former slaves. By even the most optimistic evidence, neither Negro nor plantation owner ever adjusted adequately to day or contract labor. Even allowing for white prejudices, historians have shown that this kind of freedman labor was inefficient. It did not work, and proud plantations grew up in weeds. Another disaster, quite beyond control, was that the price of cotton, the only possible cash crop, fell. Cotton sold for 30 cents a pound in 1866. It had dropped to 17 in 1870 and 13 5 years later. This savaged the small farmer in the uplands. It put the planter out of business. Under these pressures, land values collapsed. Land fell to a tenth of the 1860 price in some regions. Throughout the state, there was a general loss averaging 80%. The planters' acres became worthless. If they were mortgaged, they became a genuine liability. Mortgage sales were universal. East Texas records in these years show an almost complete turnover in ownership of land. This pressure came in an era of relatively high taxes imposed by a prodigal state government. Planters, in agonizing case after case, simply could not raise the cash. Taxes had to be paid in hard money. Everything else could be paid in kind. They lost their estates. Much harder to measure than the effects of falling cotton and land prices and the scarcity of money in East Texas was the immense psychic damage done the planters. They had been vigorous enough, but by 1860 too many of them had climbed partway up the ladder of aristocratic illusion. They had removed themselves, and above all their children, from the idea of economic competition. In the terrible debacle of 1865, planters, like most aristocrats, lacked the resilience to withstand humiliation. They did not know how to go back to making money, and most disdained such grubbing. They could no longer swim in the dirty stream that most Americans and all Southerners had to breast. They sank out of sight. Here ended that abortive culture in Texas, the Cotton Kingdom. The lands and houses of the former gentry did not disappear. In logical fashion, new families arose, but with several immense differences. The new men came from mercantile, middle-class origins. They were shrewd, tough, energetic, cynical, and generally lacking in public spirit. They despised both the languor and the airs of the planter class. This class grew up out of increasing business in the towns from the Sabine to Dallas in the west, as tracks and roads went in. It was better fitted to a sweaty, gaudy, gaslight America, and looked back on the Grecian era with contempt. It built cotton gins and warehouses, and bought up bottomlands at $2 per acre. In central Texas, some lands sold for 60 cents. These new Texans were mercantile rather than industrial, but they strongly resembled the rising Yankee industrial upper class. Their entire orientation was economic. They began to produce the same alienation toward culture that industrialism produced in the North. These new owners discovered the sharecrop solution to Negro labor and stabilized the South. They lived with most of the old trappings of Southern gentry, surrounded by Negro servants. But they developed no real ethic, nor did they attempt to become aristocrats. They were sometimes called Bourbons, and they were flamboyant and tasteless as planters never were. They peopled Faulkner's novels. The term planter survived in other states, but in Texas, the name almost entirely disappeared. During the breakup of the plantation system, the corn farmers in the interior were little disturbed by these changing social conditions. For some years, their own condition did not much change. In central West Texas, the Indian problem was paramount because the Army rendered almost no protection at this time. In fact, when it was discovered that cotton would grow well beyond the mucky alluvial soils, the new cash crop exploded westward to the Dallas-Sherman line, and farmer prosperity temporarily increased. There was a large increase in new small farms. Noticeably, there was more resistance to the new regime in the western central counties than in the east. Too much of the morale of plantation Texas had been shot away. But the western borderlands were armed, accustomed to violence, and surly. Cultural diffusion made these Texans as Yankee-hating and more Negro-despising than those of the bottomlands and piney woods. The first opposition to the Davis crowd was carried almost entirely by conservative Republicans. Democrats were still too cowed. Conservative papers protested the new acts of the legislature, while conservative legislators, when not under house arrest, orated violently on the floor. Editorial after editorial was hurled against the horrendous corruption of officials, the open sale of votes to railroad and bond lobbies, and the repressive police acts. Significantly, Morgan Hamilton, radical U.S. Senator, was scandalized by his own colleagues. Morgan Hamilton was an idealist. He believed in radical social and government reforms and the habilitation of the Negro. But he attacked the unconstitutional extension of terms of office, the militia bill, and the state police law. He said openly these were violations of the party's pledges. He also said the radicals were honor-bound to support the same liberal principles advocated by his conservative brother, Jack. Davis and Company soon got a belly full of Morgan Hamilton, as one carpetbagger put it. On a manufactured technicality, the legislature declared his election as U.S. Senator invalid. It then chose General J.J. Reynolds in his place, although it was brought out on the floor of the state Senate that Reynolds was not a Texas citizen or even a legal resident of the state. At this time, Reynolds, a brevet major general, held the rank of colonel in the regular U.S. cavalry at San Antonio. Governor Davis wired the general congratulations, and Reynolds graciously accepted. Ironically, all 12 votes cast for Hamilton in the state legislature were by Democrats. This honor to Reynolds, a man almost all Texans believed had injured and humiliated them, caused general outrage. More important, it seems to have at last turned Senator Charles Sumner's stomach. It was widely expected that President Grant would use his influence to have Reynolds seated. Reynolds did proceed to Washington on the president's order. The Senate refused to seat him. The Judiciary Committee determined that Hamilton was entitled to his full term. It was a sign in the wind that the Civil War was ending in the North. But the war was entering its most bitter phase in Texas. At the heart of the conflict were the militia bill and the state police. An odor clung to Davis's implementation of both, and on this all historians, North and South, Democrat and Republican, have agreed. The first mass resistance to the carpetbaggers began in the summer of 1871. It was spurred by the unprecedented taxation that was now being imposed. The moves were orderly and constitutional. E.M. Peace, George Hancock, and Morgan Hamilton, all Republicans, sponsored taxpayers' meetings across the state. A mass gathering of Texas taxpayers was finally held in Austin in September. It was attended by United Republicans and Democrats from 94 counties. Major George B. Erath, an early Austrian immigrant who had become prominent in Texas, held the chair. E.M. Peace addressed the convention. He attacked the disastrous financial and fiscal policies of the carpetbaggers, as the state administration was now called, and pointed out that when Davis took office there had been a healthy surplus in the Treasury. But by 1871 the state was not only bankrupt and borrowing heavily. The warrants of the state are hawked about the streets of Austin at 6 bits on the dollar and sold with difficulty. $6 million were to be levied in state taxes against an estimated $800,000 actually needed to run the state. 7 members of the Taxpayers Committee tried to meet with the governor to discuss cutting expenditures. Davis refused to see them. Balked, the committee prepared a series of honest and authoritative reports, signed by both Democrats and Republicans. These reports to the people were factual and appalling. The tax rate had risen in 2 years from 15 cents on $100 property valuation to $2.175, not including occupation taxes, city taxes, the $2 annual poll tax, or the levies to retire railroad bonds voted by the legislature. The railroad levies alone amounted to another 60 cents per $100. Approximately 21% of Texans' total income went for taxes. This would have been extraordinary in the 19th century, but supportable if the taxes were evenly applied. But they were not. They fell almost completely on property holders, and even then were levied with great injustice. Planters and farmers were being ruined. Businessmen generally escaped. There was no income tax. The reports indicated also that $695,000 rather than $6 million would adequately, if austerely, support the state government. The convention was angry over the uses for which the money was being spent. Even the school taxes were attacked because the school system created a bureaucratic hierarchy and denied local taxpayers all voice in its administration. The convention then demanded that elections be held in 1871 as required by the Constitution of 1869, despite the legislature setting this aside. If elections were not held, Peace and the others suggested a taxpayers' revolt. They did not advocate mob action, but suggested that injunctions and court action be instituted and fought in every county, while payments were held up. Davis reacted characteristically to the orderly meeting in Austin. He had radical leaders assemble a huge crowd of singing, turbulent Negroes in Austin. He marched at their head through the streets to the Capitol. At the Capitol steps, Davis addressed the throng. "The Temple of Freedom is being defiled by taxpayers," he roared to the assembled Negroes. "It is up to you, my colored brethren, to purify the place." At the governor's command, the mob formed in double ranks. "March around the building singing those glorious hymns of freedom with which you are all so familiar." An Austin newspaper printed these remarks, and also the events of the next few hours. Thereupon this squad, the most ignorant, superstitious, and servile representatives of the race, marched around the building at the hour of midnight, singing "John Brown's Soul is Marching On" and "Rally Round the Flag, Boys." A number of papers were aghast that such rabble was countenanced by the governor of the state of Texas. The Capitol was thus purified, but the taxpayers' revolt prevailed. It forced Davis to call for elections in 1871 rather than wait a year as scheduled by the Davis Law of 1870. It was apparent that conservative Republicans and Democrats were ceasing to fight the war and were fusing against the carpetbaggers. At Seguin, east of San Antonio, a great fusion rally was held. Ex-Confederate officers and staunch Unionists who had not spoken to each other for years now solemnly shook hands. Radical leaders rode to Austin, expressing fright. Davis himself was worried. He now issued an election order to the state adjutant general. All peace officers, militia, and state guard personnel were to conduct the polls, and police the conduct of the people. He threatened to declare martial law under the militia bill in any county where disorder prevailed. In effect, Union soldiers were to be replaced in this election by Davis police. The effect of this order was explosive. Conservative Republican newspapers printed denunciations. "It is impossible for us to express the indignation which it has aroused. Governor Davis and his satraps may learn to their cost that the people of Texas cannot and will not always submit to their arbitrary usurpations and tyrannical acts." Ex-Governor A.J. Hamilton openly campaigned for the Democrats. Almost all the moderate and conservative native Unionists deserted with him. Two enormously influential newspapers, which suddenly found plenty of funds, began to print Democratic news and doctrines. The San Antonio Herald and Austin Democratic Statesman overcame the advantage Davis had enjoyed through the Printing Act and his controlled press. Meanwhile, the carpetbagger group, Davis's plunderers and office holders, the Morgan Hamilton Honest Faction, and the Railroad-bought boys, were angry and quarreling among themselves. Democrats and conservative Republicans had only one real fear, that they would be defrauded again. The San Antonio Herald reported that in Harris County, Houston, colored voters never die nor remove. Of 1,500 white voters registered in 1868, which was half the real number, 250 had died or removed, including a prominent merchant now living in the city. Of 2,400 Negroes registered in 1868, of whom not more than 1,000 ever lived in the county, one had died, one removed. In these years, there had been a crying need for a genuine state police force. The frontier, The aftermath of the Civil War, the crumbling of old society and standards, and hordes of bitter and unemployed soldiers from both armies all created conditions approaching anarchy in some parts of Texas. In many counties, armed mobs of desperados held local citizens and sheriffs in virtual submission, as at Lampasas in West Texas. Davis's state police had moved courageously against criminals in certain cases, and it had done some good work. Thousands of arrests had been made, and 8 police officers killed in the line of duty. But 2 things destroyed the effectiveness of the state police. Davis gave the badge to Negroes and paranoids and to a considerable number of criminal men. He also used the state police as a political tool of repression. As the Democratic Statesman reported, "The adjutant general picks out some poor devil in the street who has not a dime in the world and tells him he would like to make a policeman out of him." The police were poorly paid, often unpaid, and they were overcharged and bilked as well. They had to pay for all their equipment. A $30 carbine was sold to them at $40. $3 deposit was withheld for their badge or shield. The treasury warrants with which they were paid depreciated to half their face value. Few reputable Texans would serve. No institution in Texas ever aroused so much hostility and hatred as the Davis police. The documented stories of oppressions and incidents are almost endless. The record of a few events tells the tale. At Galveston in 1871, Governor Davis took personal command of the city police under the militia bill and put this force under the orders of State Police Captain George Farrow. The reason was that a great political rally was being held, and the governor wanted to keep order. He did not consult Mayor Somerville, Judge Sabin, or Judge Dodge, the legally constituted local authorities. The local conservatives were silenced and crushed. In a scene described as pandemonium by a paper, 2 radicals, both Negroes, were nominated by acclamation by the party convention. A conservative, Nelson, shouted that this was a put-up job. The state police, under a Negro sergeant, cut off the gas lights and drove the convention out on the streets before the nomination could be overturned or questioned. When conservatives tried to hold a rump convention and choose an opposition slate, they were rousted out again by the police. In other conventions, the police impounded or destroyed written ballots. At another rally, when a Texas Negro tried to speak up for the Democratic Party in Austin, the city marshal strode to the platform and struck him with a whip. State police stood by laughing, ready to protect the marshal from the crowd. This meeting ended in a near-fatal shooting scrape between Radical Ratcliffe Platt, chairman of the County Executive Committee, and editor John Caldwell of the Democratic Statesman. At Dallas, a Negro orator also spoke up for Democrats. A mob of other Negroes descended on him, screaming, "Kill the damn dog! Shoot the hypocrite!" A deputy sheriff drew his pistol to protect the speaker and was arrested by the state police for inciting violence. A few white men hustled the speaker away and protected him with guns against knives and razors. At Paris, 2 policemen took a young man out of his home and shot him in the back before witnesses. At Marshall, 2 Negro officers killed another white man, an unarmed teenager who ignored arrest. There were 14 such murders in all. A real calamity occurred in Limestone County in the fall of 1871. In the town of Groesbeck, a citizen named Applewhite was murdered on the street by 4 Negro state police, who apparently were drunk. According to reliable witnesses, one killer shouted, "There is another white son of a bitch I want to kill. I will have the town flowing with white blood before morning." Flourishing pistols, the police barricaded themselves in the mayor's office, shooting at random at people who came out into the street. Mayor Zodek ordered all citizens to arm themselves, but despite flaring anger, he was able to keep control. Zodek said there would be no mob action. The killers would be arrested according to the law. While a posse was organized, the 4 police escaped out of town and rode to a Negro settlement. Here, they gathered a large body of their fellows. However, 2 of the killers were taken by the sheriff and lodged in jail. Although there was some rumbling in the Negro community, Groesbeck was quiet. In this atmosphere, radical leaders wrote to Governor Davis that Negroes were not going to be allowed to vote in the crisis. Although the evidence was entirely otherwise, no white wanted the Negroes to vote, but no one had broached doing anything about it, Davis reacted violently. He declared Limestone and neighboring Freestone counties in insurrection and under martial law. He issued a proclamation with inflammatory charges. He did not bother to notify the legislature of this act. Habeas corpus was suspended in the affected counties, the state police were sent in, and a fine of $50,000, 3% on all taxable property, was levied. There was no resistance. The state police spent their time writing about the counties collecting the fine. It was collected by a police captain and a few men, visiting each homestead in turn. This was not an isolated case. Huntsville was put under martial law and cowed, so was Walker County. Martial law was declared frequently, and noticeably where anti-Davis elements were vocal or strong. The great bitterness was caused by the fact that in virtually every case, the proclamations were unnecessary. They were political. L. H. McNelly, who was badly wounded and almost killed while acting against desperadoes as a state police captain, in an unguarded moment gave a Galveston reporter a damaging view of Davis's declarations of martial law. When asked about conditions in Walker County, which the governor described as far gone in armed rebellion, McNelly, one of the few honest police officers, suggested the real reason was money. The adjutant general was then riding through Walker County with 7 or 8 men, collecting 50 cents on each assessed $100 valuation. These fines were assessed on every resident of the county and collected at pistol point. McNelly drawled that if the county was really in rebellion, Adjutant General Davidson would need an army. When this report was printed, McNelly was forced to retract and claim he had been misquoted. These practices and perversions of the police power were enormously destructive of law and order. There was hardly a prominent, respected citizen, editor, or minister of religion in Texas who had anything but contempt for the state police. The statement of one Texas historian that this emboldened actual desperadoes everywhere is, if anything, an understatement of the case. Criminality in most occupied or oppressed countries tends to become respectable if it is combined with resistance to corrupt authority. This happened. In September 1871, John Wesley Hardin, who already had considerable reputation as a gunman and was a known desperado, was arrested by 2 Negro state policemen at Gonzales. Although both officers had the drop on Hardin, their pistols were on him and his was in his belt, he easily drew and shot them both dead. When the news of this spread about town, a group of citizens gathered about Hardin, and together they declared openly against Negro or Yankee mob rule and misrule in general, as Hardin himself told the story. "We at once got about 25 men, good and true, sent for Negroes to come along, that we would not leave enough of them to tell the tale. From that time on, we had no Negro police in Gonzales." The use of black police was too much of a setting of the bottom rail on the top. Any criminal who shot one turned into a sort of hero. The elections of 1871 were for Congress. Although armed state police stood around every polling place and broke up political rallies and demonstrations, this year thousands of white Democrats streamed to the polls. Davis canvasses threw out thousands of votes, including the entire returns of Limestone, Brazos, Bowie, and Marion counties, on specious grounds. Despite this, the Democrats carried every congressional seat. In a statewide vote of 125,812, the Democratic candidates won by a majority of 24,279. The Radicals disputed one seat, that of William T. Clark against D.C. Giddings. Governor Davis issued a certificate of election to Clark, the Radical, over Giddings, the Democrat. The contest went on in courts and in Congress for some months until, on the overwhelming evidence, Giddings was seated. In the aftermath of this dispute, the United States District Court in Texas indicated Davis for vote fraud and for issuing fraudulent election certificates, both offenses under the Federal Enforcement Act. Garland, the federal district attorney, was a Republican, but he had no intention of quashing these indictments. Garland had expressly warned Davis against issuing the false certificate when Davis had tried him out after the election. The governor's confidence in going ahead was well-founded. The Washington Chronicle, a Republican paper in the Capitol, printed that the indictment was obviously meant as an insult to President Grant. In very similar circumstances in Arkansas, Grant had removed both a federal district attorney and a U.S. Marshal who had presented evidence against Governor Powell Clayton of that state. Now, Davis, Senator J.W. Flanagan, and Texas Secretary of State Newcomb, together with the deposed Congressman Clark, wrote the president to dismiss Garland. Morgan Hamilton heard the rumors and went to the United States Attorney General. The honest radicals said bluntly that Garland's dismissal from office would be in fact telling all federal officers to ignore dirty work where high party politicians were concerned. Hamilton then departed Washington on a brief trip. The day he left the Capitol, the president dismissed Garland and appointed a replacement. The appointment was rushed through the Senate before the Texas senator returned. When the Davis election fraud case came up, the new federal attorney presented a very strange case. No documentary evidence was presented to the jury. It had somehow been mislaid. Nor was the principal witness for the prosecution called to testify. Davis was acquitted. Now, the Davis administration was beginning to show the strains of several years in office. Despite high tax collections, the Treasury was bankrupt. This fact startled a number of radicals in the Texas House. They formed an investigating committee which reported reckless disorder in the Treasury and the regular use of public funds for private ends. Treasurer George Honey kept few books. An indictment was prepared for him, but Davis had this quashed. The radicals now had to face their second national election. They approached the fall of 1872 with anger and dread. One problem was that too many former supporters, even radicals, were demanding honesty and cooperating with the enemy. It was still possible to surround polls with Negro police, but it was becoming impossible to pull the shenanigans of 1868 and 1869. There was even a certain coolness emanating toward the Texas State House from Washington. Radicals ran on the just and honest administration of U.S. Grant and on the personal integrity and incorruptibility of E.J. Davis, as their platform read. Swarming Democrats gathered at Corsicana, vowing to remove the abuses under which our people labor. Just before the election, Adjutant General James Davidson suddenly departed the state. A hasty check of the state police chief's accounts revealed a shortage of $34,434.67. General Davidson turned up sometime later in Belgium, whence he never returned. The state police again surrounded the polls on Election Day, but there were visible signs of confusion and morale failure in their ranks. The votes were counted with the usual problems, but Democrats threw the state to Horace Greeley over Grant and elected a majority of the state legislature. They won a large edge in the House and a majority of 3 in the state Senate. The governorship was not at stake. The 13th legislature approached Austin with more determination than rejoicing. There was deep sentiment to impeach Davis. The Democrats and conservatives had both the evidence and the voting strength. But caution won out. A very real fear of presidential intervention pervaded the state. Everywhere, men said that Washington would reimpose military rule if its friend in the governor's mansion were touched. All through these years, there was a noticeable hesitation on the part of Democrats to assert their rights. Their former humiliations and the constant appellation of rebels hurled at them hurt, and few of them felt they had any hope of justice from the North. Only slowly did the term "Reb" assume intimations of distinction, and the old rebel spirit break forth. The rebel legislature contented itself with demolishing the radical program. One by one, every radical act was repealed. The School Act was revised. There was too much good in it for the destruction some wanted, to wipe out the educational bureaucracy and return the schools to local county control. In a scene of great emotion, the Police Act was overturned. The House went against it by 58-7 and the Senate by 18-7, thus passing the repeal over Davis's veto. Significantly, most Republicans joined the Democrats. Only diehards dared to vote for the Davis police. John Henry Brown, who authored the repeal, wired his hometown newspaper, "The police law is abolished over the governor's veto. Glory to God in the highest. On earth peace, goodwill towards men." One editor became almost incoherent over the news. He wrote, "The people of Texas are today delivered from as infernal an engine of oppression as ever crushed any people beneath the heel of God's sunlight. The damnable police bill is ground beneath the heel of an indignant legislature." Word of the demise spread from town to town like wildfire. Bonfires were lit, saloons were packed, guns were shot off in some localities till dawn. Former state policemen sensibly disappeared. As one wrote sourly in his letter of termination, "I find great rejoicing over the repeal of the police law by the Ku Klux, murderers, and thieves." No doubt there was, but the whole population seems to have rejoiced as well. Davis had to run for re-election in 1873. The hostile legislature redistricted the state, simplified the registration procedures, and called for polls to open on the first Tuesday in December. James Throckmorton, John H. Reagan, and a number of prominent Democrats nominated a Confederate veteran, Richard Koch, for governor. By this time, the conservative Republicans had disappeared. Most shunned the term and joined the Democrats. E.J. Davis still possessed great power. He had thousands of appointed office holders, the Negro vote, and federal influence. But the Democrat Party approached the December election as a great crusade. Rupert Richardson wrote of the election of 1873, "The genius of legality had forsaken the people. Men practiced fraud unashamed." What seemed to have happened is that the carpetbaggers had taught the Texans how. Democrat politicos bluntly indicated that power would be won depending on who outfrauded whom. No practice was ignored. Negroes who were being organized by Democrats were threatened with death by the Loyal League. Democrats rode into Negro settlements and, gun on hip, ordered blacks to stay away from the polls. There was terror, intimidation, and some murders on both sides. White men in some counties pulled guns on Davis officials conducting the polls. Unregistered whites and boys years under the legal age were voted. Desperados, thieves, planters, sweaty farmers, and ministers of the gospel damned black Republican rule and voted Democrat. Koch won by more than 2-1. The great drama was not yet over. Davis, now claiming an irregularity in the election laws, tried to invalidate the result in the state Supreme Court. This was a conspiracy to set aside the election. E.J. Davis himself had proposed the Texas election codes and signed them into law. The test case that the radicals presented to the courts was planned before the election was held. The state Supreme Court was Davis appointed. On January 5, 1874, the court declared the election law was unconstitutional and that the results of the December balloting were invalid. This ruling would have prevented Democrats from assuming almost every office in the state because the Democrats had won them all. The Supreme Court's order was not resisted. It was ignored. In January, all over Texas, the newly elected officials went to their offices and took them over. In some areas, ominous crowds gathered behind them. Although Davis issued a proclamation forbidding the new officials to act or the new 14th legislature to sit, there was no one to enforce either order. Public offices changed hands. The people accepted the new officers and obeyed them. Meanwhile, the new legislature and many prominent Texans moved on Austin. The San Antonio Herald expressed the dominant mood. "If Texas is a state, and if her citizens are men, Koch will be inaugurated, and the 14th legislature will sit." Davis and his coterie were determined not to give up power. The governor played his trump card. He wired the President of the United States for military assistance to apprehend violence and put down insurrection. In very similar circumstances in Louisiana, Grant had set aside a Democratic triumph, and Davis apparently had every confidence this would happen again. A concurrent drama was acted out in Washington. The Texas congressmen, Hancock and Giddings, saw the president. They showed him copies of the state constitution and the election law. Grant read these carefully, then remarked that the proper time to have disputed them in court was before, not after the elections. Grant did not attempt to rule on the legal aspects, but he gave every indication he sniffed a rat. He told the Texans he would not send federal troops. Later, on the same day, January 12, 1874, Senator J.W. Flanagan had an audience with the president. Flanagan made a strong effort to persuade Grant to go to Davis's aid. Grant said two things that were very significant. He did not want another Louisiana fiasco where the federal government had overturned an election with bayonets, and he had to think of the congressional elections this year. The country as a whole was tired of the military occupation in the South. With some asperity, the president told Flanagan that Davis had been decisively beaten and the time had come for him to get out of the way. Flanagan then wired certain friends in Austin to withdraw. The game was up. Grant wired Davis also. "The call for troops is not made in accordance with the Constitution of the United States. Would it not be prudent as well as right to yield to the verdict of the people as expressed by their ballots?" As a Northern historian expressed it, Grant and the North were not prepared to refight the Civil War. Davis did not accede. Now, in Texas, a dangerous situation was brewing. Richard Koch, the Confederate veteran, conferred with men he knew and trusted about taking over the state government peaceably. These men were Generals Henry McCulloch and Hardeman, the sheriff of Travis County, Zimpelman, and Colonel John S. Ford. Koch wanted these former officers, who were local heroes, to try to control the public. He intended to be inaugurated. He intended the new legislature to convene, and he expected Davis to use force to prevent this. All the Texans agreed that Davis would try to use an outbreak of fighting as an excuse for Yankee intervention. They agreed to move quietly and peacefully. At this time, they did not know of Grant's wire to Davis. Acting quickly, armed citizens acting for Koch took possession of the legislative chambers in the Capitol building. They repelled an attempt of radicals to enter by force. Police acting under Davis's orders and parties of armed radicals gathered in the Capitol basement. Austin had divided into two armed camps, with the old and new governors, and both the 14th legislature and a rump of the old 13th claiming to be the legal regime. On January 15th, groups of Negroes from the country further down the Colorado River entered Austin. Davis's adjutant general armed these newcomers with rifles from the state arsenal. It appeared that bloodshed was inevitable. One Major Russell, from the staff of General Augur, commander of the U.S. Army Department of Texas, arrived at the Capitol. A rumor spread among Koch's people that Russell had told Davis the general had instructions from the president to declare federal martial law. All believed that Davis intended to provoke violence. But despite some very delicate incidents, Koch kept control. His officers, who more and more resembled a convention of Confederate survivors, kept the populace quiet. At one point, some radicals, under a carpetbagger Union officer named DeGrasse, aimed a cannon at the Capitol. But Koch's men had spiked it earlier and hugely enjoyed the frustration of Davis's men. The governor ordered out the local militia, called the Travis Rifles, only to see the company, surrounded by citizens led by Sheriff Zimpelman, go over to the other side. Davis apparently could not understand the changed temper of the North or realize that the great experiment in Texas was over. He telegraphed the president again for troops. Grant did not deign to reply personally. His answer came through the Attorney General of the United States. Your right to the office of the governor at this time is at least so doubtful that he does not feel warranted in furnishing United States troops to aid you in holding further possession of it. Governor Davis now had the choice of starting a war to hold his office against impossible odds, with no help in prospect from his northern friends, or of surrender. He felt that Grant had virtually ordered him to surrender. His organ, the Daily State Journal, expressed radical feelings in a bitter sentence. "The courts are powerless. The government of the state has been forcibly usurped, and President Grant has backed the usurpation." From his office, he could see the stacked arms of Texas militia, stacked against him. Old Rip Ford, tall, grim, still ruddy-faced and handsome at 60, was marching toward the Capitol at the head of an armed, angry, but disciplined body of men. They were singing "The Yellow Rose of Texas" in a mighty roar. Davis surrendered. He vacated his offices on Monday, January 19, 1874. He did not present Coke with a key, but that did not stop the ebullient Texans. On the orders of a state senator from East Texas, the door was broken down, and Richard Coke went in. The Secretary of State, a die-hard Unionist, was ousted from his desk. The militia paraded with music to the Capitol, where a salute of 102 guns was fired. The legislature passed a resolution thanking President U.S. Grant for his decision. Coke and his lieutenant governor, Hubbard, addressed a deliriously happy throng from the Capitol steps. The first phase of the Civil War in Texas was over. The next phase was to last at least